Hello and welcome to another video with React Native. This video will be a little bit complicated because it will cover two different topics with state management in React Native. So there are a few things that this video assumes that you already know how to do. It assumes that you know how to set up React navigation with different components. So as you can see here, we have a first component, second component, and third component in our stack navigator here. So that's all we have for this file, and then we have an app container that we use with create app container. It also assumes that you are familiar with functional components. So our first component is a functional component. So is our second component. So let's go to the third component and see what we have here. I created a state, name, kebab, calories, 110. I have a component did mount here. So this component did mount, this fetch result is not being used for anything, but you'll see why I have this later. But for now, we're just doing a fetch and we're just showing a brewery and we are logging that to the console here. So again, we're not using this yet. So let's go down to the render here. We're showing two text views with the name state and the calorie state. And we have text inputs where we have our on-change text and we're setting the state here with name and calories. So as we type here, you can see that our state is being updated. I'm assuming that you already know how to do all this stuff already. This is the normal way that you would use state inside of your app or inside of your component here. So the first thing I want to do is create a new class in our provider folder here. So I'm going to go new file and call it foodprovider.js. So if we go to our docs here, the context API, it basically allows you to share values between components without having to pass the props down the tree to different components. So you can share state from component A to component Z without passing it from A to B to C to D, etc. So that's the reason why you would want to use context API. It's pretty powerful for React. So let's go back to our app here. So food provider will be a stateful component because we're going to store our state here for our app. So let's import React from React. So we will create a normal class. We'll do class food provider and we'll do extends React dot component. And then we'll just have a normal state. So we'll have state equals, we will use the same values from before. We'll do name and we'll set it to tacos and we'll have calories and we'll set it to 90, I guess. So now we want to actually create two functions for our state. We want to do set name and we can pass in the name. And because this is the same as our state name, we can do this dot set state and just do name. And now we do something similar for our calories. We do set calories, pass in calories here, and set the state for calories. Okay, and now we do our render function. So we do render and return. So now we need to know what to return here. So everything so far should look very familiar. So now we want to return a component here, but we want to return an actual provider from our context. So we want to create a context. We do constant, I'm going to call it food context, and do equals react dot create context. If you want to know more about create context, you can look here in the docs and you can see create context here. It provides the current context value from the provider. So let's go back here and we have our food context here. So now we actually return a food context dot provider. So if you want the children to have the same props, you can do this too. You can do this dot props dot children. This isn't required, but if you want to pass in some child props here, this is how you would do that. But the real magic comes here with the values prop, which is part of the provider class here. So the values represents the object that you want available to your other components in your component tree. For us, it's going to be an object itself. So we want to pass in all these different state names here and the functions. So we want to do name and this dot state dot name, calories, this dot state dot calories, and then we pass in the functions here. Okay, so this is all part of this object here. So we're passing in a single object with these key value pairs here. So pretty simple stuff so far. It's just a basic stateful component. So the last thing we need to do here is we need to actually export these values. So we do export food provider. I'm going to export both the provider and the context. So food context, and these are named exports now. We have that. And let's go to our app now. So in our app here, we want the food object to be available to all of our components. So we do that by wrapping our app container in the provider. So first let's import the named food provider, can't spell today, from source provider, okay. So now we just wrap this with the food provider, and that's it for our app.js here. So we can just close that for now. So I hope this makes sense. So far, we created a food provider class, which is basically just a component that takes in values of our state here and our functions to set the state. So we've done something like this in previous videos before, but now we're using a specific context API here. So let's go to our third component now. Now our name and calories exist within our food provider, so we can get rid of this state here. And we want to import the food context now. So let's import named food context from provider, food provider. And now we want to wrap our container here with our food context, but we want to get the consumer from it. So we can do food context dot consumer, and then we wrap the view in that, okay? The consumer takes in a function. We need to actually wrap this in here. So we do this. So the consumer gives us the value that we have in the provider. Oops, before I go any further, this should be value, not values, okay? So let's go back to our third component here. So the consumer takes in a function that returns a component. We want to call it food in our case. And then we just return this container here with this UI. So there's a few other things that we want to do here. We no longer have the state here. I got rid of the state object. So now we have access to our food. So our food has name and calories. So we can just say food.name, and we can say food.calories. And here, instead of this.setState, we have our setState methods. So we can do food.setName, and then we pass in the text, and we can just copy and paste that here and say set calories. And then we can save and reload. Name of null. Okay, so yeah, I forgot to set it here too. So we do food.name and we do food.calories. Okay, so now we no longer have any local state here. So let's save, reload. So now let's see what happens if we type something in here. You can see that the behavior is exactly the same. So that's pretty impressive that we've been able to offload our state to this food provider here. But the magic happens because we have a consumer now. So our consumer means that if the food data changes, this gets rebuilt, but our first component doesn't get rebuilt and our second component doesn't get rebuilt. Now this gets rebuilt if the food changes. And the fact that we don't have any state now inside of our third component means that we can change this to a functional component if we want to. So I'm going to first comment this out. We'll come back to this later. In our third component here, we'll just do constant, third component, and then we'll do equals this. And now we will remove our render here. And now we can change our state from our functional component here, which is pretty nice. So we have access to our food state, and we can change our food state from this functional component because we're accessing the consumer or the context API. And that ends the context portion of our video. So now let's go on to the hooks portion. So if you're not familiar with hooks, you should definitely read the documents a little bit here. We're going to focus on the basic hooks here. We're going to focus on useState, useContext, and useEffect. So useState is a way to handle local state without actually needing a stateful component. So we can hook into the React library without using a React component. We'll see how this works in a second. So let's go to our app here, and we'll go to our food provider. So as you can see here, we have our state as you've seen before. This is the basic way that you would learn state when you learn React Native or React.js. But now we want to get rid of all of these here. So let's comment this out for a second. And we're going to import something from React called useState. So useState allows us to hook into the React state from our component. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to change this to a functional component. So we do constant food provider. You've seen all this before, equals this. Okay, and now get rid of the render and get rid of this. And we will come back to this in a second. So in order to use state, we create a tuple. A tuple is just an array with different types of values. So we do constant, and then we do brackets, and we're going to say name and set name. So this is the tuple here, and then we say equals useState. So useState takes in a few different values. The thing that you'll use the most is the initial state. So you'll probably set something, so useState, and here we have tacos. So now we're going to say tacos here. And I want to hammer home the point here that this corresponds to the name state here and this set state function. So this does the same thing, which is pretty cool if you ask me. So now we want to do the same thing with the calories. So we do constant calories and set calories equal useState. And then for the calories, let's do 80 this time. So that replaced this entire block here. So let's get rid of this. And actually, we could just use the shortcut here because these are the same. So we can just do name calories, set name, set calories, just comma, comma, comma. Okay. And since we're not using a stateful component, we need to get rid of this keyword. And then we're passing the props here, and now we can save. And as you can see, our state is 80 and tacos here. So now let's update this. And as you can see, everything behaves exactly the same as before. So you can see this is a lot cleaner than what we had before. So useState is extremely powerful. You define your variable name in your state, and then you define the function that you use to actually set that state. And this also lets you turn all of your stateful components into stateless components. So you can use functional components in your entire app without ever extending React.component. So that covers useState. So let's go back to our docs here. We have useState, and we also have, let's go down here to useContext. So useContext is a way for you to use the context in different places in your app. So I'm going to use the useContext method in regards to our context API. But there's different use cases for it. You can use useContext with theme context if you want to. You'll see that example a lot on various websites. But if we go back to our app here, I want to go to my third component now. And you can see that we're using food context.consumer. But what if there's an even easier way to write this code? Well, there is now. So let's go up here to our imports, and we're going to import useContext from React. So this is just another hook that is built into the React library. Okay, and down here, we're going to say constant food equals useContext, and then we just pass in the context that we already have. So we have food context here. So we pass in food context. So this allows us to use the same food context, which is the value from our food provider here. It allows us to use that instead of food context.consumer. So now we can get rid of this again. So now we have our food here, and everything should work the same as before. So let's save. And everything is the exact same. So now this replaces that food context.consumer. So yeah, I hope this is giving you a taste of how powerful hooks are. We will go over all this again at the end of the video. So our food allows us to access our values from the food provider here. So there's one more thing that I want to go over. I'm going to go over useEffect. useEffect lets you handle side effects in your app. So for example, if you're getting data from an API and you want to do something with that data when you actually load a component or when you update a component, then useEffect is a good option to use instead of using a stateful component. So let's go back to our app here. And we're going to take this code here and cut it. And we're going to put it in our food provider. Normally you would use component.mount, and then you would fetch the data, and then you would do something with it, like set your state. But for our app here, we're going to use useEffect. That's also part of the React library, so we use useEffect. And then we say useEffect, and then it takes in a function here. So what you return here will get ran when component.didMount gets called and when component.didUpdate gets called. So that's very important to remember. So we're going to have a block here, and we're going to put this code inside of here. So let's do this. I'm going to say useEffect called. Okay, and let's save this. So I forgot to add the async here. So we do async here first. So async, let's save, reload. And so as you can see, we have a warning here saying that an effect function must not return anything besides a function which is used for cleanup. So it doesn't like the use of asynchronous functions here for useEffect. I'm going to separate this out a bit. So I'm going to create a new asynchronous function. We're going to call it set food from URL. We're not actually going to use anything with the data, but we're just going to show you how this works. And I'm going to say async. And we're going to copy and paste these lines into here. And we're going to get rid of this and call set food from URL here. Okay, let's save. And that got rid of that error, or that warning. I don't really use it a lot. I mainly focus on useState and useContext. Those are the two big ones. So let's go to our logs real quick. Save again. And you can see that that line was called here. Food provider 13. So useEffect is a function that must be named this exactly for it to work correctly. So yeah, I hope this all makes sense. Let's go over all of this again real quick. So the food provider is a functional component that takes advantage of hooks and context API. So the context API allows us to pass the value down through our component tree to different components. So if you had maybe 10 components, you could wrap your app in the provider like we did here. And then in your 10th component, or in our case, our third component, you can use the context here to populate your UI from that state, and you can set the state from here too, without using an actual React component. And the hooks API allows us to get our context from our food provider and just get that exact value that we define in our food provider here. And the useState line here allows us to hook into the state functionality of our React library without using a React component. So we define a state name, state calories, set the state name, set the state calories, and we can pass all of this into our provider, which is then available to all of our components inside of our app. So there's one more thing that I want to do to show you how all of this works together. I want to actually use this with React navigation. Let's go to our first component now. I want to get rid of the second component here, and I just want to have a button. So let's have a button, and we're going to have title, and we're going to say go to second component, and now we're going to have onPress, props, which we need to define here, props.navigation.navigate. This should look very familiar if you looked at my video on React navigation. And then we do second component, because that's what we called it in our app.js file. Okay, and now we can get rid of this. Let's save. And now let's go to our second component and do a very similar thing here. So we'll paste this in here, go to third component, call this third component, and save. And I just want to show you that this works with React navigation pretty easily. Let's save. So now let's actually press the buttons, go to second component. Oops, forgot to import the button here. Go to second component, go to third, and we forgot to add the props here again. So save, go to second, go to third, and now you can see that we are back to our third component, which works the exact same way as before. And you can see how powerful this stuff is. It allows you to write much cleaner code. Everything is very modular. You can imagine how this would look in a much larger app. So yeah, I hope this all makes sense, and this is very powerful. If you're not using it in your apps, I hope this convinces you why you should be using it. This can essentially replace all your stateful components in your app. Yeah, this is very powerful stuff. I love Context API, and I love the Hooks API. But there's a lot more to learn. If you go back to your documentation here, you can see they have a lot more information about all three of these things: useEffect, useContext, and useState. And there's a lot more that you can do, and we will cover things in the future as we need to. So yeah, subscribe for more videos, and happy coding. Bye.